I left the courthouse without a word after the divorce, and minutes later, I rode away in a billionaire's limousine. But what he did not know was that the billionaire had come for me because I held the power to decide the future of his company. I left the courthouse without a word after the divorce, and minutes later, I rode away in a billionaire's limousine. But what Preston did not know was that the man inside had not come to rescue me. He had come because I held the power to decide the future of his company. The black limousine rolled to the curb with the quiet confidence of something that never needed to announce its importance. Its polished body reflected the gray courthouse steps, the brass doors, and the small crowd of reporters waiting beneath the afternoon sky. Marceline Rowe stood beneath the stone archway with a slim leather portfolio against her side. The final divorce papers had been signed 7 minutes earlier. Her wedding ring rested inside a sealed envelope in her attorney's briefcase. Behind her, Preston Vale was still speaking to the press as though the end of their marriage were another successful business transaction. Elise Hartwell stood beside him in a fitted ivory coat, one hand resting lightly on his arm. She smiled whenever a camera turned in her direction. Preston had always loved a polished picture, especially when the truth behind it was inconvenient. Marceline heard his voice carry across the steps. He was explaining that the divorce had been respectful, mature, and inevitable. Then he laughed softly and added that some people discovered too late how expensive independence could be. A few reporters smiled. Elise lowered her eyes in a performance of sympathy. Marceline did not turn around. She had spent 12 years translating Preston's ambition into numbers that banks could trust. She had spent even longer learning how he used charm to disguise cruelty. Today, his words no longer reached the part of her that once needed his approval. The limousine stopped directly in front of her. A chauffeur in a black suit stepped out, walked around the vehicle, and opened the rear door. "Ms. Rowe," he said with quiet respect, "Mr. Bell is waiting." The name changed the air around them. Preston stopped speaking. Bell Meridian Group was one of the most powerful investment firms in the country, and Cash and Bell was known for avoiding public attention. Preston had tried for nearly 2 years to secure a meeting with him. Now Bell's car was waiting for Marceline. She descended the courthouse steps without hurry. Her sapphire dress moved beneath a cream coat draped over her shoulders, and her heels made a soft, measured sound against the stone. The reporters shifted toward her. Cameras turned. Questions began to rise, but she answered none of them. Preston moved down one step, his confidence replaced by confusion. "Marcy," he called. It was the first time that day he had used the name that once belonged only to people who knew her well. She did not look back. Elise's smile faded as she studied the limousine, then Preston. Marceline reached the open door and saw Cash and Bell seated inside, a silver folder resting across his knees. He did not offer flowers. He did not offer pity. He simply met her eyes and said, "We have a great deal to discuss." Marceline placed one hand on the door frame and entered the car. Outside, Preston stood beneath the courthouse columns, watching the woman he believed had left with nothing disappear behind tinted glass. He had no idea that the folder waiting in her lap contained the financial future of Vale Hospitality. 7 minutes earlier, the courtroom had felt colder than the weather outside. Marceline sat beside Lenora Pike at a polished wooden table, her hands folded over a slim leather portfolio while the judge reviewed the final agreement. Across the aisle, Preston occupied the space as though it belonged to him. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his silver watch visible beneath one cuff, and Elise sat one row behind him in an ivory coat chosen carefully enough to look innocent in photographs. The papers reduced 12 years of marriage to property, signatures, and dates. Marceline would keep the modest apartment she had purchased before the wedding, her personal savings, and full ownership of every financial model, restructuring system, and advisory document she had created under her own name. Preston would retain control of Vale Hospitality, the city penthouse, and the public image he had protected more fiercely than their marriage. He considered the arrangement generous because he did not understand the value of what she had refused to surrender. When the judge asked whether both parties accepted the terms, Preston answered first, "Yes, Your Honor." His voice carried the smooth confidence he used with investors. Marceline waited until the room was still. "Yes, Your Honor." She did not look at him. The judge signed the order, wished them both well, and moved to the next case. That was all. No music, no dramatic declaration, only the faint scrape of chairs and the quiet closing of a file. Preston rose immediately, already checking his phone. Elise met him near the aisle and touched his sleeve with the practiced concern of someone aware that people were watching. Lenora remained seated beside Marceline. "You can take a moment," she said. Marceline looked down at the gold band on her left hand. For years, it had represented promises she kept long after Preston stopped honoring them. She slid it free, placed it in a small envelope, and handed it to Lenora. "Please add this to the personal property inventory." Lenora accepted it without comment. She understood that some endings became more painful when other people tried to soften them. Near the courtroom doors, Preston spoke quietly to his attorney, but not quietly enough. "She wanted independence," he said. "Now she can see what it costs." Elise gave a sympathetic smile. "She will be fine," she replied, though her tone suggested the opposite. Preston glanced toward Marceline. "For a while, then the bills will start." Marceline heard every word. She also heard the uncertainty beneath them. Preston needed her future to be smaller than his, because anything else would force him to reconsider the story he had told about their marriage. Lenora closed her briefcase. "The car should be waiting." Marceline gave a small nod. Her phone had vibrated once during the hearing with a message containing only 4 words. "We are at the curb." She slipped it back into her bag before Preston could notice. As they entered the hallway, reporters gathered near the elevators. Vale Hospitality had become a regional success story, and Preston enjoyed attention whenever he could control the angle. He walked ahead with Elise beside him, already preparing the expression he would wear outside. Marceline followed at a measured pace. On the courthouse steps, Preston paused before the cameras and began describing the divorce as respectful and mutual. Then one reporter asked whether Marceline would remain involved with the company. Preston smiled. "Marcy was never involved in operations," he said. "She preferred a quieter life." Lenora turned toward her, anger flashing briefly in her eyes. Marceline touched her arm once, a silent request to let the lie stand for a few more minutes. She stepped away from the microphones and moved beneath the stone archway. Behind her, Preston continued rewriting the past. Ahead of her, traffic slowed near the curb. A long black limousine appeared between 2 ordinary sedans, its silver emblem catching the afternoon light. Marceline recognized the Bell Meridian mark immediately. So did Preston. His voice stopped in the middle of a sentence. For one suspended moment, the courthouse steps seemed to forget how to breathe. Preston's unfinished sentence hung before the microphones while every camera shifted toward the limousine gliding to the curb. The silver Bell Meridian emblem was small, almost discreet, but Preston recognized it immediately. 2 years earlier, he had sent Cash and Bell 3 proposals, requested introductions through mutual contacts, and even attended a charity dinner in hopes of securing a conversation. None of it had brought him closer than a polite acknowledgement from an assistant. Now Bell Meridian's car had stopped for the woman Preston had just dismissed as uninvolved. Elise followed his gaze. "Do you know that car?" she asked under her breath. Preston recovered quickly enough to face the reporters again. "As I was saying, Marcy always preferred privacy." His smile returned, but it looked thinner now. "I am sure she has arranged transportation." The word transportation made the limousine sound ordinary, and Preston needed it to be ordinary. He needed the moment to remain inside the story he had prepared. The successful founder moving forward, the quiet former wife leaving with a modest settlement, the elegant new woman standing at his side. Marceline waited beneath the archway as the chauffeur stepped onto the sidewalk. He was an older man with silver at his temples and the calm posture of someone accustomed to opening doors for people who never had to ask twice. He approached her directly. "Ms. Rowe," he said, clear enough for the nearest microphones to capture. "Mr. Bell apologizes for the delay." A ripple moved through the reporters. One of them called out, "Ms. Rowe, are you meeting with Cash and Bell?" Another asked whether Bell Meridian had business with Vale Hospitality. Preston descended one step before stopping himself. Elise's hand tightened around his arm. Marceline looked at the open door, then at Lenora, who stood several feet away with a restrained expression of satisfaction. The leather portfolio beneath Marceline's arm contained copies of the intellectual property schedule, the old consulting agreement, and the final divorce order. None of the documents looked dramatic. Together, they represented the part of her life Preston had never bothered to read carefully. "Marcy," Preston called again. This time his voice carried less confidence and more command. She turned only enough to acknowledge that she had heard him. He stepped away from the microphones. "A word, please." The reporters leaned closer. Elise released his arm. Marceline remained still. Preston lowered his voice as he approached, though the nearest cameras continued recording. "What is this?" he asked. "A car," she replied. It was the first sentence she had spoken to him since leaving the courtroom. His eyes narrowed. "Do not play games. Why is Cashinbel waiting for you?" Marceline's expression did not change. "That is no longer your concern." The answer was quiet, but it landed with the finality of the judge's signature. Preston glanced toward the limousine and then at the portfolio in her hand. "Does this have something to do with the company?" She said nothing. Behind them, one reporter asked Preston whether Bell Meridian had become an investor. Another called Marceline's name. Elise watched the exchange with growing unease. "Preston," she said softly, "you told me Bell would not return your calls." He ignored her. "Marcy, whatever you think you are doing, you need to understand that Vale Hospitality is not part of the divorce." Marceline met his eyes. For 12 years, she had explained risks he refused to see and repaired decisions he would not admit were mistakes. She no longer owed him advance warning. "Then you have nothing to worry about," she said. The chauffeur held the door wider. Marceline moved toward it without haste. Preston remained on the sidewalk, surrounded by cameras and questions he could no longer control. Elise looked from him to the limousine, and for the first time, the polished future he had promised her seemed less certain than the quiet woman stepping away. Marceline paused beside the open limousine door, not because she doubted her decision, but because she wanted to feel the exact moment when silence stopped being something Preston used against her and became something she chose for herself. The courthouse steps behind her were crowded with questions, cameras, and the polished version of the truth he had spent years building. She could hear reporters asking whether Cashinbel was involved with Vale Hospitality, whether the divorce had affected the company, whether she had been working with Bell Meridian in secret. Preston answered none of them. For once, he did not have a prepared statement. Marceline opened her leather portfolio and removed the small envelope Lenora had given her inside the courtroom. Her wedding ring rested within it, warm from the brief time it had remained in her hand. She looked at the gold band once. There had been a season when she believed wearing it meant being chosen. Later, she learned that a promise could remain on a finger long after it disappeared from a marriage. She handed the envelope back to Lenora. "Keep it with the final inventory," she said. Her voice was calm and clear. Preston moved closer. "Marcy, wait." She did not. The chauffeur offered his hand only as a courtesy, and she accepted it with a slight nod before lowering herself into the car. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Cashinbel sat across from her in a dark navy suit, his silver folder closed on the seat beside him. He watched her with the respectful patience of a man who understood that some thresholds should not be rushed. Outside, Preston reached the curb just as the chauffeur began to close the door. "This is not over," he said. The words carried less threat than disbelief. Marceline looked at him through the narrowing space. 12 years of marriage stood between them. The first struggling hotel, the late nights with financial reports spread across their kitchen table, the conferences where he repeated her ideas without naming her, the dinners where he asked her to smile, while he introduced Elise as the future of the company. She could have corrected him in front of everyone. She could have told the reporters that Bell Meridian had requested her expertise, that the systems supporting Vale Hospitality were hers, or that Preston had misunderstood the settlement he had been so eager to sign. Instead, she said nothing. The door closed with a soft, precise sound. Tinted glass replaced his face with a blurred reflection of the courthouse columns. Cashin reached for the silver folder, but did not open it yet. "Would you like a moment?" he asked. Marceline placed her portfolio beside her and looked through the opposite window. The city moved around them in ordinary details. A woman balancing grocery bags, a city bus stopping at the corner, an older couple sharing an umbrella beneath the light rain. Life had continued while her marriage ended, indifferent but strangely reassuring. "No," she said. "I have given that ending enough time." Cashin nodded and signaled the driver. The limousine pulled away from the curb. Through the rear window, Preston grew smaller among the reporters. Elise stood several feet behind him now, her expression no longer supportive but uncertain. Marceline did not turn for a better view. She looked forward as Cashin placed the folder between them. On its cover, beneath the bell, Meridian emblem, were the words Vale Hospitality Strategic Review. "Before we begin," he said, "I want you to understand that your position here is not connected to your divorce." Marceline met his eyes. "I would not have accepted it if it were." A faint look of approval touched his face. Then he opened the folder, revealing years of financial records from the company Preston believed she had left behind. The courthouse disappeared around the next corner, and Marceline felt no urge to look back. The limousine moved through downtown traffic while Cashin turned the first page of the strategic review. Marceline recognized the numbers before she recognized the formatting. Vale Hospitality had grown from one struggling hotel into a regional chain of 14 properties. But beneath the polished photographs and confident projections, the company was carrying more risk than Preston had admitted. Occupancy had fallen at 3 locations. Renovation costs had doubled at 2 others. A short-term loan was approaching renewal, and the lender had begun asking questions Preston could not answer with charm. Cashin watched her read. "What do you see?" he asked. Marceline did not respond immediately. She traced one column with her finger, then another. "He is using future bookings to make current revenue look stronger." Cashin nodded. "And here." She turned the page. "Deferred maintenance." He moved it out of operating expenses and into a capital plan that was never funded. "You found that in less than 2 minutes. I built the original reporting system." The words left her without pride or bitterness. They were simply true. Cashin leaned back. "That is why you are here." Outside the tinted windows, the city passed in muted flashes of gray stone, wet pavement, and traffic lights reflected in the rain. Marceline remembered a different drive 12 years earlier, when Preston had taken her to see the first hotel he hoped to buy. The building had stood near the interstate, 3 stories of faded brick with a leaking roof and nearly empty rooms. He had been 32, handsome, restless, and convinced that confidence could replace capital. Marceline was 27 and already respected at Halden National Bank for finding weaknesses in deals other analysts approved too quickly. She had spent 6 nights reviewing the hotel's books at their kitchen table. Preston slept beside open folders while she rebuilt the financial model from the ground up. She discovered an unused tax credit, renegotiated a vendor agreement, and persuaded a retired developer to guarantee part of the loan. The deal closed because of her work. At the celebration dinner, Preston raised a glass and thanked everyone who believed in his vision. He kissed her cheek and called her his lucky charm. The investors laughed warmly. Marceline smiled because she loved him and because, at the time, she believed private gratitude was enough. 1 hotel became 3. 3 became 7. Each expansion arrived with another request for her help. Preston would place financial statements in front of her after dinner and ask whether something looked wrong. She would find the hidden cost, the weak assumption, the clause that could become dangerous later. By morning, he would present the solution to his team as though it had come to him in the shower. The first time it happened, Marceline told herself he had forgotten to mention her. The 10th time, she understood he had remembered not to. Cashin turned to a page marked with a red tab. "Your former husband submitted these projections to Bell Meridian 6 months ago." Marceline studied them. Several of the assumptions came directly from an old expansion model she had created, but key warnings had been removed. Preston had kept the growth targets and discarded the safeguards. "He changed the debt limit," she said. "My model capped borrowing at 40% of property value. He raised it to 65. Then he removed the stress test." Cashin closed the folder halfway. "Can the company survive if the lender refuses renewal?" Marceline looked through the window at the courthouse now miles behind them. Preston had told the press she had never been involved in operations. He had believed repeating the lie would make it safe. "Yes," she said at last, "but not if he remains the only person making decisions." Cashin held her gaze. "That is the conclusion I reached. I wanted to know whether you would." He opened the folder to the final section. A formal consulting offer rested beneath her name, not his. For the first time in years, Marceline saw her work waiting to be credited before it was used. Long before Vale Hospitality had a glass headquarters and a name that appeared in business magazines, Preston Vale worked from a rented office above a furniture store near the edge of Charlotte. The space smelled faintly of dust and old carpet, and the single window looked across a parking lot faded by years of summer heat. He owned 1 hotel then, a tired roadside property with 48 rooms, a broken ice machine, and a mortgage payment due every month whether guests arrived or not. Marceline still worked at Halden National Bank, where she spent her days evaluating risks for people who believed enthusiasm was a substitute for preparation. She would leave the office after dark, drive 20 miles to the hotel, and sit beside Preston at a small desk behind the front counter. Together, they reviewed invoices, occupancy reports, and repair estimates beneath fluorescent lights that made everything look more exhausted than it was. Preston hated numbers unless they carried good news. Marceline understood that numbers were most useful when they told the truth early enough to change it. She discovered that the hotel was paying nearly twice the standard rate for linens because Preston had signed a long-term contract without comparing vendors. She found insurance coverage the previous owner had forgotten to cancel, a tax classification that had been filed incorrectly, and a maintenance schedule so disorganized that 3 repairs had been paid for twice. Each correction seemed small on its own. Together, they kept the business alive. Preston began calling her for meetings whenever a lender asked a question he could not answer. She would step into the hallway at the bank, listen to his hurried explanation, and quietly give him the language he needed. Later, he would tell her the call went well because he knew how to handle difficult people. Marceline told herself that success did not need equal applause to be shared. At home, she built the first expansion model on a laptop balanced across their dining table. The model compared revenue by season, labor costs by shift, and renovation spending by room. It showed Preston that buying a second property would only work if he delayed cosmetic upgrades and renegotiated the first hotel's debt. He followed her plan, though he later described the decision as instinct. When the second hotel opened, a local newspaper photographed Preston beneath a ribbon stretched across the entrance. Marceline stood 3 people away from him, partly hidden behind a city councilman. The article called Preston a visionary entrepreneur who had rescued 2 struggling properties through bold leadership. Her name appeared once, in a caption identifying her as his supportive wife. She read the article at breakfast and folded it neatly before placing it beside his coffee. Preston kissed her forehead. "They never get the details right," he said. Then he carried the paper to work and framed the article for his office. Years later, the frame still hung behind his desk, visible in every interview. The photograph captured the beginning of the story exactly as Preston preferred to remember it. He stood in the center, smiling toward the future. Marceline remained near the edge, close enough to prove she had been there, distant enough to be forgotten. What the photograph did not show was the notebook in her purse containing the numbers that made the second hotel possible. It did not show the evenings she spent protecting payroll, the calls she made to nervous creditors, or the promotion she declined because Preston said he needed her available while the company expanded. He had not built the first foundation alone. He had simply learned how to stand where the cameras could not see who was holding it steady. The erasure did not happen all at once. It came in polished sentences, practical suggestions, and decisions framed as temporary. When Vail Hospitality acquired its 4th property, Preston asked Marceline to leave Halden National Bank for 1 year. He said the company needed someone he trusted, and no one understood the financial structure better than she did. He promised she would return to banking once the expansion stabilized. Marceline believed him because trust still sounded like partnership then. She resigned from a position she had spent 9 years earning and moved into a quiet office 2 floors below Preston's. Her title was strategic advisor, though she performed the work of a chief financial officer without the authority or public recognition. She rebuilt budgets, negotiated vendor contracts, and created a risk system that flagged weak properties before they became expensive failures. Under her guidance, the company avoided 2 bad acquisitions and refinanced its debt at a lower rate. Preston praised her in private. In public, he called her his secret weapon, a phrase that sounded affectionate until she realized secret meant invisible. At executive meetings, Marceline would present a recommendation, and Preston would summarize it 5 minutes later in a stronger voice. The room would nod at him. When she raised concerns about borrowing too aggressively, he smiled and told the board that his wife naturally worried about worst-case scenarios. The same warning, repeated by a male consultant weeks later, became a responsible strategic adjustment. Marceline noticed. She also noticed how often Preston began referring to the company as his vision and her work as support. At first, She corrected small details. Then she stopped, not because they no longer mattered, but because every correction became an argument about loyalty. "Why do you need credit from strangers?" he asked one night in their penthouse kitchen. "You know what you mean to me." She stood beside the marble island with a report still open on her tablet. "I need my work identified as mine." Preston loosened his tie and sighed as though she had made a simple evening difficult. "We are married. There is no mine and yours." The sentence sounded generous until she understood it applied only to what she created. His title remained his. His company remained his. His interviews, awards, and decisions remained his. Only her labor became shared. As the hotels grew more successful, Preston hired a larger executive team and moved Marceline's office farther from the center of operations. He said clients found it confusing when his wife attended financial meetings without a formal corporate role. He replaced her title with family office consultant, then stopped including the title on event invitations. At annual galas, photographers asked her to stand closer to Preston and turn slightly toward the light. Reporters asked which designer she was wearing and whether she enjoyed traveling between the properties. No one asked how she had structured the acquisition fund. Preston answered business questions while resting one hand at her waist, a gesture that looked loving and felt like placement. The final change came when he hired Elise Hartwell to modernize the company's image. Elise filled the headquarters with new branding, glossy photographs, and language about bold leadership. In a promotional video, Preston stood alone in the first hotel and described how he had built the business from instinct, courage, and sacrifice. Marceline watched from the back of the screening room. The camera passed over the old front desk, where she had once balanced payroll at midnight, but her name was never spoken. When the video ended, everyone applauded. Preston turned toward her with a satisfied smile. "What do you think?" he asked. Marceline looked at the screen, now dark enough to reflect her face. "It is exactly the story you wanted," she said. He accepted the answer as praise. Elise Hartwell entered Vale Hospitality with the confidence of someone who understood that modern power often arrived through a camera lens. She was 33, polished, quick with names, and skilled at turning ordinary announcements into stories about momentum. Within 6 months, Preston began bringing her into meetings that had nothing to do with public relations. He praised her instinct, her energy, and the way she understood where the company needed to go. Marceline recognized the language because he had once used it about her. At first, the changes were small. Elise joined business dinners that had previously been private. She began texting Preston after hours about interviews, travel schedules, and investor appearances. Her notes appeared beside his coffee in the mornings. When Marceline questioned the blurred boundaries, Preston accused her of being suspicious and old-fashioned. "She is building our future," he said. "You should be grateful someone still believes in growth." Marceline looked at him across the breakfast table and wondered when caution had become a flaw simply because it came from her. The truth revealed itself slowly, then all at once. A hotel receipt appeared in Preston's coat pocket from a property 2 hours away on a night he claimed to be in Atlanta. Elise's name appeared beside his on a private itinerary. Then Marceline found a draft press statement announcing that Preston and Elise had become the public face of a new era for Vale Hospitality. The document made no mention of divorce, but the photographs attached to it told a complete story. Preston stood beside Elise beneath the company logo, both of them smiling with the ease of people already rehearsing a future together. Marceline placed the pages on his desk that evening. Preston read the first line, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled as if she had forced him into an inconvenience. He did not apologize. "We have been unhappy for years," he said. "Elise understands the demands of my life. I built the structure that made your life possible." "There," he replied, almost wearily. "That is exactly the problem. You always make everything about what you did." The sentence was so cleanly cruel that Marceline felt something inside her become quiet. Preston continued, mistaking her silence for permission. He said she had become cautious, withdrawn, and uncomfortable with success. He said Elise brought optimism into rooms Marceline filled with warnings. Most of all, he said the marriage had become an obstacle to the company's future. Marceline listened without interrupting. She remembered every night she had stayed awake to protect payroll, every promotion she had declined, every idea he had carried into a boardroom under his own name. Preston was not leaving because she had failed him. He was leaving because she remembered too clearly how much he owed. 3 weeks later, Elise attended a charity dinner on his arm. The photographs appeared online before midnight. Preston looked relaxed, almost relieved. Marceline sat alone in the penthouse library and studied one image longer than she intended. Elise wore a silver gown and rested her hand against Preston's chest. The caption called them a dynamic leadership pair. Marceline closed the page and opened a new document. At the top, she typed an inventory of every financial model, risk system, expansion framework, and advisory plan she had created before and during her work with Vail Hospitality. She included dates, file names, contract references, and proof of authorship. It was not revenge. It was memory arranged into evidence. When Lenora Pike reviewed the list days later, she looked up slowly. "Does Preston know you own these?" Marceline thought of the dark promotional screen reflecting her face. "He knows I made them," she said. He simply never believed that mattered. Lenora discovered the first clue in a contract Preston had signed 11 years earlier, back when Vail Hospitality was still small enough for every agreement to fit inside a single filing cabinet. The document identified Marceline as an independent strategic consultant and stated that all original models, forecasting systems, and proprietary methods she created would remain her intellectual property unless transferred through a separate written agreement. No such agreement existed. Preston had signed the contract quickly, more interested in securing a bank loan than reading the final pages. Years later, his lawyers copied sections from that same contract into later corporate documents without noticing what it preserved. Lenora spread the papers across her conference table and tapped the ownership clause with one finger. "He built the company around your systems," she said, "but he never acquired them." Marceline sat across from her, the city lights reflected in the dark windows behind them. She felt no triumph, only the slow return of something that had been taken without ever being formally surrendered. "Can he still use them?" she asked. "Only under the limited consulting license in the original agreement." "That license ended when your advisory relationship ended." "And when did that happen?" Lenora turned to a resignation letter Preston's office had prepared 3 years earlier, after he decided Marceline's presence complicated the company's public structure. He had asked her to sign it at home between dinner and a charity event. The letter removed her from all consulting responsibilities immediately. At the time, he presented it as a clean administrative step. In reality, it terminated his company's legal right to continue using her protected work. "The date is clear," Lenora said. "Everything after this point may require permission." Marceline remembered the evening. Preston had placed the document beside her plate and said the lawyers were simplifying titles before a financing round. She had asked whether she should review it with counsel. He looked offended. "You trust me, do you not?" She signed because she still believed trust was something they shared. Now the same signature he had requested for convenience had become evidence of separation. Lenora contacted a forensic accountant and a technology specialist. Together, they traced Marceline's original formulas through Vail Hospitality's current reporting system. Her risk scores appeared in acquisition reviews. Her seasonal revenue model guided pricing. Her debt warning thresholds still determined which properties received additional funding, although Preston had altered several limits to support faster growth. Even the dashboard he demonstrated during investor presentations had been built from a framework Marceline designed at their dining table. Her name had been removed from the screen, but the structure remained unmistakably hers. He did not just borrow ideas, the specialist said. "The company depends on the architecture of your work." Marceline looked at the printed diagrams. For years, Preston had described her as someone who preferred a quiet life, as though quiet meant empty. The truth was visible in every line connecting the company's decisions. She had been present even after he removed her title. Lenora leaned back. "This gives you leverage in the divorce." Marceline shook her head. "I do not want the systems traded for the penthouse or used to punish him." "Then what do you want?" She considered the employees who had built careers inside Vail Hospitality, the front desk managers, housekeepers, maintenance teams, and accountants who had nothing to do with Preston's choices. Destroying the company would hurt people he rarely remembered by name. "I want the record corrected," she said. "I want control over how my work is used, and I want the company protected from the risks he keeps hiding." Lenora studied her, then smiled faintly. "You are still trying to save it." "No," Marceline replied. I am trying to stop him from calling rescue ownership. 2 days later, an email arrived from Bell Meridian Group requesting a confidential meeting. Cash and Bell had reviewed Vail Hospitality's financing proposal and noticed inconsistencies between the company's current projections and archived models bearing Marceline's authorship. He did not ask to speak with Preston. He asked to speak with her. Marceline read the message twice before answering. For the first time, someone looking at the company had followed the work back to the woman who created it. Cash and Bell had arranged the first meeting in a private conference room at Bell Meridian headquarters, 42 floors above the city and far from the social circles where Preston usually performed his confidence. Marceline arrived 10 minutes early with Lenora beside her and a portfolio containing the original contracts, authorship records, and system diagrams. Cashin entered without an entourage. He was 52, composed, and dressed with the quiet precision of a man who had no need to display his wealth. He greeted Lenora, then turned to Marceline. I have spent 3 months trying to understand how Vail Hospitality grew so quickly without collapsing under its own debt, he said. Your name kept appearing beneath the surface. Preston would have treated the comment as praise. Marceline heard it as a question. And what did you find? Cashin opened a financial report. A company built on disciplined systems, then gradually separated from the discipline that created them. He showed her the proposal Preston had submitted to Bell Meridian. The document promised aggressive expansion, higher borrowing, and rapid renovation across several properties. It used Marceline's forecasting framework, but removed the safeguards that limited risk. I do not invest in confidence, Cashin said. I invest in structures that can survive the person presenting them. Marceline studied the pages. Then you should not approve this proposal. Lenora glanced toward her, but Cashin only nodded. That was my conclusion. He closed the report and placed a second folder on the table. I want you to lead an independent review. Marceline did not touch the folder. You understand that Preston is my husband. For now, Cashin replied. I also understand that your personal relationship does not change authorship, financial reality, or fiduciary responsibility. His tone contained no pity. He was not interested in rescuing a betrayed wife or humiliating an overconfident founder. He wanted the truth of the business, and he believed Marceline was qualified to find it. That distinction mattered. What happens if the review shows the company is unstable? She asked. Bell Meridian may acquire its debt, require a restructuring, or walk away. And if the instability comes from Preston's decisions? Cashin met her eyes. Then his title will not protect him. Marceline finally opened the folder. The proposed engagement identified her as lead strategic advisor with full access to financial records, executive interviews, and board materials. Her name appeared at the top of every page. The compensation was substantial, but the authority mattered more. She would not be asked to whisper solutions into someone else's ear. She would sign the conclusions herself. I have conditions, she said. Cashin waited. The review remains confidential until the divorce is final. Employees are protected from retaliation. No recommendation should punish staff for choices made by leadership. And my intellectual property cannot be used as leverage without my approval. Cashin looked toward Lenora, who gave a slight nod. Agreed, he said. There is one more condition. Marceline rested her hand on the open folder. I will not be presented as the former wife helping you understand her husband's company. I will be presented by my professional name. Cashin's expression softened with respect. Marceline Rowe. Yes. He extended his hand across the table. Then, that is the name on the engagement. She accepted. Weeks later, when the limousine carried her away from the courthouse, Cashin placed that same silver folder between them. He opened to the final page, where Bell Meridian's board authorization waited beside her signature line. This is not charity, he said. I did not come to rescue you. Marceline looked at the city moving beyond the tinted window. Good. Cashin handed her the pen. I came because you are the only person qualified to rescue the deal. She signed her name without hesitation. The first sign that the balance had shifted came before the limousine reached Bell Meridian headquarters. Preston's phone lit with a call from Vail Hospitality's lead board member, Thomas Wexler, who rarely contacted him without an assistant arranging it first. Preston answered from the courthouse steps, still watching the black car disappear into traffic. Thomas, I am in the middle of something. So are we, Wexler replied. His voice was clipped and unusually cold. Bell Meridian has suspended all financing discussions. Preston turned away from the reporters. Elise stood a few feet behind him, pretending not to listen. Suspended is not canceled, he said. Cash and Bell likes to create pressure. This is not pressure. They requested a full legal review of the strategic systems in our investor materials. Preston's hand tightened around the phone. That is routine. They also asked whether the company has the right to use them. For a moment, Preston heard only the traffic and the faint clicking of cameras. He looked toward the curb where the limousine had been, as though Marceline might still be standing there waiting for him to understand. Of course we do, he said. Those systems were developed in-house. Wexler paused. By whom? Preston glanced at Elise. Her expression had changed. The polished certainty she wore beside him had given way to a careful, searching look. Marcy helped with some early models, he said. But they belong to the company. Our counsel has not found a transfer agreement. Then tell counsel to look harder. They did. What they found was an expired consulting license and a resignation letter that ended our authorized use 3 years ago. Preston stepped farther from the microphones. This is a technical issue. It is a material issue, Wexler replied. Bell Meridian has delayed the debt package until ownership is resolved. The board is meeting at 4. The call ended before Preston could answer. A second notification appeared almost immediately, this one from corporate counsel requesting every contract connected to Marceline Rowe. Then came a message from the chief financial officer warning that the company's lender had asked whether Vail Hospitality's projections relied on disputed intellectual property. Preston read the words twice. Around him, reporters continued calling questions, but their voices seemed distant now. Elise approached. What is happening? Nothing that cannot be fixed. Bell Meridian stopped the financing. He looked at her sharply. You were listening. You were standing 10 feet away. She lowered her voice. Did Marceline create the systems? Preston slipped the phone into his pocket. She worked on them years ago. That is not what I asked. His silence answered more than he intended. Elise folded her arms beneath the ivory coat. You told me she was never involved in operations. She was not an executive. Was she involved? Preston looked toward the courthouse doors, searching for a place where the conversation could become private. There was none. Every surface reflected him back. The glass entrance, the limousine's fading image in a reporter's camera, even the polished brass railing beside the steps. Marcy reviewed numbers, he said. She had a talent for details. Elise stared at him. A talent for details? He heard how small the phrase sounded only after saying it. Inside the limousine, several blocks away, Marceline's phone remained silent. Cashin had instructed his team to route all communication through Lenora until the review officially began. He did not want Preston reaching her before the facts had time to arrive. Marceline opened the silver folder to a section marked Governance Risk. At the top of the first page was a recommendation Bell Meridian had already drafted. Suspend executive authority over financial decisions pending independent review. Preston still stood on the courthouse steps believing he had lost control because a lender had become cautious. He did not yet understand that the board was about to ask who had truly been guiding the company all along. By 4 o'clock, the boardroom at Vail Hospitality no longer felt like Preston's territory. The long glass table was lined with legal folders, printed financial reports, and copies of the original consulting agreement bearing Marceline's name. Thomas Wexler sat at the head of the table, not Preston. Corporate counsel occupied the seat beside him. The chief financial officer avoided Preston's eyes. Elise had not been invited. Preston entered carrying the same confidence he had worn outside the courthouse, but the room did not rise to meet it. Let us be clear, he began. This is a temporary misunderstanding caused by personal timing. Wexler folded his hands. The company's access to its core financial systems may have expired 3 years ago. That is not personal timing. Preston placed both palms on the table. Those systems were developed for Vail Hospitality. They were developed by Marceline Rowe under a contract that preserved her ownership. Corporate counsel slid the document forward. Preston did not touch it. She was my wife. The words sounded weaker in a room governed by signatures. She was also an independent consultant, counsel replied. The two facts are not interchangeable. Wexler turned to the chief financial officer. How much of our current forecasting depends on her framework? Most of it, he admitted. Revenue projections, acquisition scoring, debt alerts, seasonal pricing, and renovation planning. Preston looked around the table. Then license it. That decision belongs to Ms. Rowe, Wexler said. The room became silent. For years, Preston had treated Marceline's work as something he could carry from one meeting to another without asking. Now every person at the table was waiting for permission from the woman he had just told the press was never involved. The independent review began the following morning. Marceline arrived at Bell Meridian headquarters wearing a charcoal suit and carrying the same leather portfolio she had taken from the courthouse. Cashin introduced her to the review team without mentioning the divorce. Marceline Rowe will lead the engagement, he said. All findings and recommendations will be issued under her authority. No one called her Mrs. Vale. No one asked whether Preston approved. For 3 weeks, Marceline examined contracts, loan schedules, renovation budgets, and internal messages. She found weak decisions, but she also found valuable properties and capable employees who had spent years compensating for leadership they could not challenge. The company did not need to be destroyed. It needed to stop orbiting one man's pride. Her final proposal required Vale Hospitality to acknowledge her ownership, purchase a long-term license for the systems, protect employee pensions, reduce expansion, and appoint an independent chief financial officer. The most difficult condition concerned Preston. He would step down as chief executive and remain only as a limited advisor during the transition. Cashin read the proposal in silence. You could demand more, he said. I do not need more. He may say you used the divorce to remove him. Marceline closed the file. Then the records will show otherwise. Bell Meridian accepted every condition. At the next board meeting, Preston received the restructuring package. He turned directly to the final page and saw Marceline's signature above the title Lead Strategic Advisor. You gave her this authority? He asked Wexler. She earned it long before we recognized it. Preston requested a private meeting with her. Marceline agreed only after the board vote. They met in a conference room where the city stretched below them in clear afternoon light. He looked older than he had on the courthouse steps. You could have saved my position, he said. I saved the company. At my expense. Marceline held his gaze. No, Preston. At the expense of the story you told about building it alone. He looked down at the papers between them, where her name appeared again and again. For once, there was nothing left for him to rewrite. 6 months later, Marceline stood beneath the lights of the National Hospitality Investment Forum with her full name displayed across the screen behind her. Marceline Rowe, Managing Partner, Bell Meridian Hospitality Fund. The ballroom at the convention center held more than 800 investors, executives, and industry leaders, but the room felt quieter than any boardroom she had ever entered. She wore a deep blue suit with clean lines and no unnecessary ornament. Her hair swept away from her face, her expression composed. Cashin sat in the front row, not as a rescuer, but as a partner who had known when to step aside and let her work speak. Marceline presented a new investment model built around sustainable growth, employee protection, and transparent risk. She spoke without rushing. Every number was hers. Every conclusion carried her name. No one interrupted to explain her own ideas back to her. No one reduced her judgment to caution or called her contribution support. When she finished, the audience rose in a long wave of applause. Marceline accepted it with a small nod, feeling not triumph over Preston, but the return of something much older and more important, recognition without permission. Vale Hospitality had survived the restructuring. 3 underperforming properties were sold, employee retirement accounts were protected, and the company's debt was brought under control. Preston remained as a limited advisor, stripped of the authority he once treated as a natural extension of his identity. Elise left within weeks of his removal as chief executive. Her departure was quiet, explained publicly as a new professional opportunity. Marceline felt no satisfaction in it. Elise had not created Preston's need to erase other people. She had simply believed the version of him that required that erasure. After the forum, Marceline walked through the hotel lobby while guests approached to shake her hand. An older black woman who owned 2 small inns in Georgia stopped her near the elevators. I spent 20 years letting my husband call my work family help, she said. Today was the first time I heard someone say it was expertise. Marceline held her hand for a moment. It always was. Outside, the evening air was cool, and the city lights reflected across the wet pavement. A black limousine waited at the curb, the same silver bell meridian emblem shining near the rear door. This time, the image carried no mystery. The chauffeur opened the door because Marceline had another meeting, another fund, and another room waiting for her decisions. Before she stepped inside, her phone lit with a message from Preston. "I never knew how much of it was you." She read the sentence once. Months earlier, those words might have reached the part of her that still wanted an apology to repair what recognition had failed to protect. Now they felt incomplete. He had known enough to use her judgment, enough to repeat her ideas, enough to ask for her help whenever the numbers turned against him. What he had never believed was that her value could exist beyond his access to it. Marceline locked the screen and placed the phone in her bag. She did not answer. Inside the limousine, Cashin had left a new portfolio on the seat beside her. The cover bore the name Rome Meridian Women and Hospitality Initiative, a fund Marceline had designed to support women whose work had remained invisible inside family businesses. She opened the first page as the car pulled away. The courthouse, the divorce, and Preston's final performance belonged to another chapter now. Through the window, the city moved forward in ribbons of gold and white. Marceline did not look behind her. She had spent too many years standing at the edge of someone else's story. At last, the road ahead carried her own name.